August 6th, 1942. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine decks of the aircraft carrier Shikaku as she sat anchored in the protected waters of Truk Lagoon below deck, in a cramped conference room that reeked of cigarette smoke and desperation. 6 Japanese naval officers sat around a scarred wooden table. Charts and intelligence reports were scattered across the surface like fallen leaves. No one had spoken for nearly 15 minutes. The silence was suffocating. Finally, Rear Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack force just 8 months earlier, cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss what these numbers are telling us. What happened at Pearl Harbor may have doomed us all." The room remained silent, but every man present understood the weight of those words. August 6th, 1942, marked exactly 8 months since the surprise attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. The attack that was meant to force America to negotiate peace. The attack that was designed to give Japan the breathing room it needed to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific. Instead, Pearl Harbor had awakened something monstrous. To understand how these seasoned naval commanders reached this devastating conclusion, we need to examine the cold mathematics of warfare that were staring them in the face that morning. Because by August 1942, the numbers told a story that no amount of fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could overcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had always understood the fundamental problem. Japan's industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Japan's oil production without imports was essentially zero. Japan's population was less than half of America's. In a prolonged war of attrition, these disparities guaranteed defeat. Yamamoto had opposed war with the United States for exactly this reason, arguing that Japan simply could not win such a conflict. But he had been overruled by army leaders and government officials who believed American democracy was weak and decadent. They convinced themselves that Americans lacked the will to fight a long war, that a quick series of victories would force American capitulation, that Pearl Harbor would be the knockout punch that ended the fight before it truly began. Every single one of these assumptions was proving catastrophically wrong. The Pearl Harbor attack had achieved tactical brilliance. Japanese aircraft had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships. They had destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground. They had killed over 2,400 Americans. The attack was executed with precision and daring that military historians would study for decades. But tactical success had masked strategic catastrophe. The most critical failure became apparent immediately to those paying attention. The American aircraft carriers weren't in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea, untouched. The massive fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of oil, weren't targeted. The submarine base was ignored. The repair facilities remained intact. These oversights would prove fatal to Japan's long-term prospects. More devastating still was the psychological impact. Pearl Harbor had looked like treachery. Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack began. Due to decoding delays, the declaration was delivered after the attack started. This made Pearl Harbor appear as a sneak attack, a violation of international norms that enraged the American public in ways Japanese planners had never anticipated. Instead of demoralizing America into negotiating, Pearl Harbor had unified American opinion like nothing else could. American war bonds were oversubscribed. Factories were running 3 shifts. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The attack had given President Roosevelt exactly what he needed to mobilize a reluctant nation for total war. Now, 8 months later, the consequences were becoming mathematically undeniable. Captain Minoru Genda, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, pulled out a folder thick with intelligence reports. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The documents inside detailed American industrial production figures that defied comprehension. In 1941, American factories had produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories had produced about 5,000. But the gap was widening exponentially. American production was accelerating while Japanese production struggled to maintain current levels. Intelligence estimates suggested that by 1943, the United States would produce 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan would produce perhaps 16,000 if everything went perfectly. The carrier numbers were even more shocking. The United States had over a dozen fleet carriers under construction. Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan could build. The first ones would enter service in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would have numerical superiority so overwhelming that Japanese defensive strategy would become mathematically impossible. But perhaps most devastating of all were the pilot training figures. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These men had trained for years. They were arguably the best carrier pilots in the world in December 1941. By August 1942, roughly 40% of them were dead, killed at Coral Sea, Midway, and in the grinding attrition of ongoing Pacific operations, the survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day with inadequate rest. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training programs were producing maybe 100 new carrier-qualified pilots per month. These new pilots had perhaps 200 hours of flight time compared to the 800-plus hours the veterans had accumulated before the war. American pilot production told a different story entirely. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly. Their training wasn't as intensive initially, but the sheer numbers meant that American losses could be replaced rapidly. Japanese losses couldn't be replaced at all. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of Pearl Harbor attackers, calculated that at current attrition rates, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers they had operational. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable in a way that American pilots simply weren't. The submarine warfare statistics painted an equally grim picture. Japanese submarines had achieved minimal success despite sophisticated designs and capable crews. They were being used primarily for fleet support rather than commerce raiding. Meanwhile, American submarines were beginning to strangle Japanese merchant shipping with increasing effectiveness. Japan's economy depended entirely on imports. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from multiple sources. All of it had to be shipped through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had lost 15 merchant ships to submarine attack. By June, they were losing 30 ships per month. By August, the rate had increased to 40 ships monthly. The trend line was terrifying. At this rate, by 1944, Japan wouldn't have enough merchant shipping to maintain basic economic function, much less support military operations scattered across the Pacific. Japan's shipbuilding capacity couldn't keep pace with losses. They could build perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year. They were losing 300,000 tons per year, and the losses were accelerating with each passing month. Admiral Nagumo looked around the table at his fellow officers. These were men who had planned and executed some of the most daring naval operations in history. They had conquered vast territories in 6 months, making Germany master of continental Europe look modest by comparison. But now they were forced to confront an uncomfortable mathematical reality. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece that guaranteed strategic defeat. The attack that was supposed to end the war quickly had instead ensured it would drag on until Japan's inevitable collapse. The strategic situation had become equally nightmarish. Japan's lightning conquests had created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands all required garrisons. Defending this vast empire meant dispersing Japanese forces across dozens of isolated outposts, many in locations that were difficult to supply and impossible to reinforce quickly. The Americans, by contrast, enjoyed the luxury of concentration. They could choose where and when to attack. Japan had to defend everywhere simultaneously. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equal forces, the Americans held the tactical advantage. But forces weren't equal anymore. American strength was growing exponentially, while Japanese strength declined with each engagement. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, one of Japan's most experienced submarine commanders, had been summoned to provide his assessment of the maritime war. His report was devastating in its clinical precision. Japanese submarines, despite their technological sophistication and crew expertise, were achieving a kill rate of approximately 1 ship per patrol. American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels at triple that rate, while operating in far more dangerous waters closer to Japanese home bases. The disparity wasn't due to inferior Japanese technology or tactics. It was purely mathematical. American submarines had virtually unlimited targets. Japanese merchant shipping moved in predictable patterns along established routes. American industrial capacity meant that even heavy submarine losses could be quickly replaced. Japanese submarine losses, like pilot losses, were essentially irreplaceable given current production capabilities. More ominous still was intelligence regarding American code-breaking efforts. Japanese naval codes were being read by American cryptographers with increasing frequency and accuracy. Every operation plan, every ship movement, every strategic intention was potentially known to the enemy before execution. Fighting a war when your opponent can read your communications is nearly impossible under the best circumstances. When that opponent also possesses overwhelming industrial superiority, defeat becomes mathematically inevitable. The Battle of Midway in June had provided the clearest demonstration of this intelligence advantage. Japanese forces had approached what they believed would be a surprise attack on American positions. Instead, they had sailed into a carefully prepared trap. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air crews had been catastrophic, not just tactically, but strategically. Those carriers represented years of construction and training that Japan could never recover. Admiral Nagumo pulled out another document that made the situation even more desperate. It was an economic analysis prepared by the Naval General Staff in cooperation with the Finance Ministry. The report projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios. Even the most optimistic projections showed economic collapse by late 1944. Japan's wartime economy was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Steel production was being diverted from civilian infrastructure to military hardware. Food rationing was already affecting civilian morale. Fuel shortages were forcing reductions in training programs and maintenance schedules. The nation was literally consuming itself to feed the war machine. The document included comparative analysis with American economic capacity that was almost too depressing to contemplate. American steel production in 1942 exceeded Japan's total industrial output across all sectors. American oil production was over 100 times greater than Japan's domestic capacity. American shipbuilding facilities could construct more tonnage in a month than Japanese yards could produce in a year. These weren't temporary disparities that could be overcome through superior tactics or fighting spirit. They represented fundamental differences in industrial base and resource availability that no amount of military genius could bridge. Japan was fighting an opponent that could afford to lose battles and still win the war through sheer productive capacity. Commander Fuchida raised the possibility that had haunted Japanese planning from the beginning. Perhaps Pearl Harbor itself had been the wrong target entirely. What if Japan had focused its initial strikes on British and Dutch colonial possessions without attacking American territory? Would the United States have entered the Pacific War immediately? The consensus around the table was uncertain but troubling. President Roosevelt clearly wanted to enter the war against both Germany and Japan. But American public opinion in December 1941 had been deeply isolationist. Without Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war on Japan? Possibly not immediately. Japan might have gained months or even years to consolidate its conquests without facing American opposition. Instead, Pearl Harbor had given Roosevelt exactly what he needed to mobilize a reluctant democracy for total war. The attack had transformed American public opinion overnight from isolation to vengeance. Americans weren't calculating costs and benefits of Pacific involvement. They wanted complete destruction of the Japanese empire. This psychological transformation meant there would be no negotiated peace, no compromise settlement, no face-saving withdrawal. America demanded unconditional surrender. The irony was bitter beyond expression. The attack designed to prevent American entry into the Pacific War had instead guaranteed American entry under the worst possible circumstances for Japan. Instead of facing a reluctant democracy unsure about distant territorial disputes, Japan now faced an enraged industrial giant determined to fight until Tokyo itself lay in ruins. Admiral Nagumo closed the folder containing casualty estimates from ongoing operations in the Solomon Islands. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal just yesterday, August 7th. Early reports suggested the landings had been successful, with minimal Japanese resistance. Another strategic position was being contested, another drain on Japan's dwindling resources. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. America was implementing a methodical strategy of seizing forward bases, building airfields, using those airfields to dominate surrounding areas, then advancing to the next objective. It was grinding, systematic, and it worked because American industrial capacity could sustain losses that would cripple Japan's ability to continue fighting. Each battle was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every level. Ships, aircraft, pilots, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, trained mechanics, experienced officers. Every category showed the same inexorable trend toward Japanese defeat. The mathematics were inescapable. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success that guaranteed strategic catastrophe. The attack that was supposed to end the war quickly had instead ensured it would continue until Japan's complete destruction. 8 months after their moment of triumph, these admirals finally understood they had won a battle that guaranteed losing the war. The war. The silence stretched on for another 10 minutes before Captain Gender finally spoke what every man in that room was thinking. The numbers don't lie, gentlemen. We're looking at industrial production figures that make our entire war effort seem like a child playing with toy soldiers. He spread out a series of charts that naval intelligence had compiled from captured documents and radio intercepts. The data painted a picture so stark that several officers initially questioned its accuracy. But repeated analysis had confirmed the horrifying truth. American shipyards were launching new vessels at a pace that defied comprehension. Liberty ships, the basic cargo vessels that kept American supply lines functioning, were being completed in an average of 42 days. 42 days from laying the keel to launching a completed vessel. Japanese shipyards required 6 months to build equivalent tonnage, assuming they had the raw materials available, but cargo ships were just the beginning. American naval construction programs included dozens of fleet carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and submarine production rates that staggered Japanese planners. The United States was building submarines faster than Japan could sink them. They were constructing carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. They were training pilots faster than Japan could shoot them down. The mathematical reality was becoming undeniable. Every American loss could be replaced within months. Every Japanese loss was essentially permanent, given current production constraints. Admiral Yamaguchi, who had commanded carriers at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, pulled out his personal notes from recent combat operations. The degradation in Japanese pilot quality was becoming apparent to anyone paying attention. New replacement pilots arriving at forward bases had flight experience measured in dozens of hours rather than hundreds. They were being shot down at rates that made sustained operations impossible. At Midway, Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, but approximately 200 of their most experienced naval aviators. These weren't just pilots. They were flight leaders, navigation specialists, torpedo attack experts, dive bombing instructors. Men whose knowledge and tactical expertise had taken years to develop. Their deaths created knowledge gaps that couldn't be filled by reading training manuals or attending abbreviated courses. American pilot training, while less intensive initially, was producing aviators in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. American training programs were graduating thousands of pilots monthly from dozens of flight schools across the continental United States. Japan was producing perhaps a few hundred pilots monthly from facilities that were increasingly vulnerable to air attack. The fuel situation was becoming equally desperate. Japan's entire strategic calculus had been built around securing oil from the Dutch East Indies. American embargoes had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military operations. Seizing the Indonesian oil fields had been meant to solve this crisis permanently. But success in capturing the fields had created new problems that Japanese planners hadn't fully anticipated. The oil had to be transported to Japan through waters increasingly patrolled by American submarines. Tankers were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. In January 1942, Japan had successfully imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports had dropped to 250,000 tons monthly. The trend was mathematically unsustainable. Submarine warfare was creating an oil blockade that would eventually strangle Japan's war machine, regardless of how many oil fields they controlled. Having access to petroleum deposits meant nothing if the fuel couldn't reach Japanese refineries and storage facilities. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe provided additional context that made the situation even more desperate. American submarines were evolving tactically at a pace that surprised Japanese anti-submarine specialists. Early in the war, American torpedo problems had limited submarine effectiveness, but those technical issues were being resolved rapidly, and American submarine commanders were becoming increasingly aggressive and successful. Japanese anti-submarine warfare capabilities, meanwhile, were being stretched beyond their limits. Escort vessels were in short supply, sonar equipment was primitive by American standards, and convoy routing was predictable enough that experienced submarine commanders could anticipate shipping movements. August 6, 1942, was the day Japan's admirals confronted an inescapable mathematical reality. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece that guaranteed strategic defeat. The attack, meant to cripple American resolve, had instead unified an industrial giant whose productive capacity dwarfed Japan's entire war machine. 8 months after their moment of triumph, these naval commanders understood they had executed a perfect operation that doomed their nation to destruction. Sometimes the greatest victories plant the seeds of ultimate defeat.